Okay, here we go. So welcome to a whole new series, a whole new topic after we did mixed bag musings for what, 3-4 years? We are moving on to sacred seasons, rhythms, and rituals in religious holidays across faith traditions. So this class comes out of the mixed bag musings process. One of the questions was asking how do different religious traditions celebrate different holidays. And at first I thought, I would kind of do this the traditional way and do a session on Christianity and a session on Islam and a session on Hinduism and, on and on and on. But it occurred to me that a lot of these different faith traditions share a lot in common in terms of the types of things that they are celebrating in their holidays and when they are celebrating those holidays. So instead of doing it the traditional way, I thought what we would do this year is we would actually go by topics and talk about what all the different faith traditions do within that particular topic. So when we get to the end of today, we will talk a little bit about some of what those categories or topics are going to look like. But in order to get us started, Diane, I'm going to mute you because it's making a little noise. I think it's your fan or something. But if you want to talk, feel free to unmute. You don't need to turn it off. It's all right. I just, unless you're talking, we can keep it muted. So today we're going to just talk about some preliminary ideas related to celebration of holidays and the passage of time, basically. So introducing kind of the concept of why do we experience the passage of time from a religious perspective. So to get started, I just want to talk a little bit about what our perspective is. How do you know that time is passing? And we can talk about this from a variety of levels. How do you know that hours are passing, days passing, months passing, years passing? Thoughts?
Are you asking us?
Yeah.
Well, we have all kinds of things, calendars, watches, we pay a lot of attention to that. And
so
I don't even really
measure it using devices that we've created.
Yeah, and I don't even really know what time is,
Well, and then there's rhythms too, daytime, nighttime, hunger, sleep.
Yeah. So we have body rhythms and kind of biological clock rhythms in the day and the night.
Yeah, but nobody pays any attention to that.
Well, I think it depends on what stage of life you're in. So if you're in school, teenager, whatever, school year, sports and all of those things are seasons. If you're a parent, it depends on, what's going on. As we age, sometimes it's like, what day is it? Once you retire, it's like, is this Monday or is it Wednesday? So I think it, obviously seasonally, even just the sun and the seasons. And I'm not talking about what you see in the stores.
Not Halloween season, but autumn and spring and things like that. Yeah. So the passing of time in nature and the cycles of growth and blossoming and death. of plants and animals and things like that. Aging of children, or puppies, or bunny rabbits, or whatever it is you've got to watch as they age. Things
Okay.
things change. Um, so there are a lot of different things that we use to kind of recognize the passage of time.
The other thing for older people, sometimes you go, gosh, was that 3 years ago or 5 years ago? What were we doing? And even,
Uh-huh.
how old were the kids when we went here?
Yeah,
So
so
you go,
looking
oh,
back,
that was 3 years ago, or.
uh-huh. So looking back at things that have happened in the past and trying to figure out when they happened are based on the changes in our lives and the changes in what we're doing with our time. That helps us to differentiate.
My dogs know better what time it is than I do,
Your dog knows better what time it is, yes, because they know when it's time to eat and time to sleep and time to go out, right?
and time to get up in the morning.
Yeah.
Yep.
So there's the rhythm of our needs that can help us with time, or some of us are better at recognizing those than others, I think. There's the rhythms of our aging, the rhythms of the aging of people around us. I think that for me, the most basic way of knowing that time is passing, whether it's a second or an hour or a year or a lifetime, is something changes. You can't know if time is passing if nothing changes. If you are sitting in a room looking around and everything is frozen, then you can't really know if time is passing. And that's what they do in movies, right? To show that somebody has frozen time somehow. They'll have everybody is frozen in place. The clock is not ticking anymore. The people are not moving. The fly maybe is frozen in midair, unable to continue moving forward because time is not passing. So nothing is changing. So time, I think, has to do with change, whether that change is small. I know that a second has gone by because I um, my mouth is in a different position than it was a second ago. Or I know that a year has gone by because I have more gray hairs here at my temples. Or I know that a decade has gone by because my child went from this big to a full grown human. All of those things that are changes that take place that help us to see that time is passing. Any other comments on any of that before we move on? So I think the difference for humans versus other kinds of creatures is not necessarily that we notice that time passes, because as we mentioned in our conversation, animals know that time passes. Our dogs know when it's time to eat and time to sleep and time to get up and time to go out. But I think for humans, it's not just about acknowledging and being aware that time is passing, that things are changing, but wanting to give meaning to it. Why is time passing? What's different today than it was yesterday? Or what's different this year than it was last year? Our awareness of death, not just as as something that is happening in the moment, but as something that um, we are aware of, even if it's not happening right at that second to someone else or to ourselves. Awareness that we will someday die, I think, forces the issue for humanity in a way that it doesn't for other types of animals. Does life have meaning if it's going to end? Why does it have to end? And then that has something to do with time as well. And then when we're talking about the why, because we are aware of death, because we're aware of the passage of time, because we are trying to give meaning to all of this, then we start thinking about what will time look like when we are no longer part of it? And how do we make sure that to some degree we leave our mark? We have something to do with what comes after our time is up, so that as time continues, we are still part of it in some way. Whether that means that we um, prove that we are, prove that we are relevant now and prove that we will be relevant in the future because of something that we did, establishing that legacy, figuring out some way to live forever in a different way, even if our bodies are no longer living. This reminds me of, for example, when I was in high school, we had to read the was it I guess it was like Scandinavian or German or something, the epic Beowulf. Did anybody else have to read that? Or maybe you read it with
Yeah,
students or something.
no,
And
we did.
so much of that story is about creating that legacy, that belief that if you do heroic deeds, then you can be sung about in, hundreds of years later in the songs of your people. And in some way, that is your eternal life. That, yeah, you're not around anymore, but your story lives on. And so you live on in some kind of spiritual way um, in that. So I know I'm getting a little esoteric with this one, but I'm trying to kind of help us to get to the core of this, this idea of seasons and time, and why do we celebrate the passage of time?
Do do you think that everybody thinks about the legacy they're leaving, either consciously or subconsciously? Like I have children, that's my legacy, or is it maybe a subset of, and I don't want to use the word ego, but some people really want to leave a legacy, and other people, I think, I'm just here. I'm gonna do what I'm here, and then whatever happens, happens. Is that part of that?
I think it depends on the person, certainly, and how what their personal level of concern about those questions is. Some people are just kind of more philosophically driven, and other people are, more um, detail engineer types of people, and they don't think about those, weird big picture philosophy things. They'd rather work on math and things like that just freak me out. Everybody's got their different brain. But I think that we're actually going to talk a little bit about kind of the history of pre-religion in a couple slides, and I think that there is something in the human DNA, in the human experience as a whole, that is about making meaning. And whether that meaning that you're making is about, big questions about what is the meaning of the world and what is the meaning of life, or whether that meaning is looking for patterns in the smallest sets of, whatever kind of engineering scientific thing you're working on. I think that there is something about being human that requires that we make meaning. And I think actually a lot of that has to do with this slide that I have up here. This kind of ages me in particular to a certain generation, I think, because are you afraid of the dark? Well, is not just a question, but for me, it is a old TV show that ran on Nickelodeon for several years in the early 1990s, I think, late 80s maybe. And children would sit around a fake campfire and tell each other ghost and horror stories that were, not kid friendly enough to put on TV for children. And Are You Afraid of the Dark? I think is one of those basic human questions, and I think it has to do with the passage of time, with this desire for meaning, with this idea about change, because the dark is the most basic human fear because it has to do with the most basic human desire, which is for control and survival. That we are trying to survive, and to survive, we need to control our environment. And so, dark prevents us from being able to see. There are going to be predators out there that have better night vision than us. We have all kinds of scientific studies that tell us that when you can't see anything, when you are blind, um, your brain fills in what you can't see. And so that's why people often will, think that they see something in the shadows that's not really there. Or, people who have recently lost their sight due to an accident or something will, quote unquote, see things that aren't really there. All kinds of studies about how our brains are wired to see things, to have that um, input of data from what our eyes are looking at so that it can process that. And if it doesn't have any of that input, it creates its own input so that those parts of our brain can continue to function and work. And so we fill that in, and that creates, fear, that creates vulnerability, that creates the unknown. It makes us lose our control. Um, the need for sleep as part of that, changing the passage of time. If I wake up and I'm awake right now, I'm safer because I'm aware of what's going on around me. But at some point, as time passes, I am going to get fatigued and I'm going to need to sleep. And if I'm unconscious, then I can't be aware of the predators that might be around me or the other dangers that might put me in a vulnerable situation where I might not be able to survive. The darkness also prevents us from being able to be distracted. If we have lots of visual stimulus around us, then it's easier to be able to, distract ourselves, whether consciously or subconsciously, from thinking about things that maybe we don't want to think about as much, which is why, for instance, children are afraid of the monster under their bed, but they're not afraid of the monster under their dining room table, because when they're awake and the sun is shining or the lights are on, they have lots of things to look at. They don't need to think about that. But when they're laying there in the darkness, they don't really have anything to think about other than what ifs and all those types of things. And so historically, even in the times before modern humans, there is um, this this biological reason for us to be concerned about the passage of time in relationship to our own survival and our own instincts, even as animals. And so as humans developed, they have their animal instincts, but then they also start to develop that uniquely human desire for meaning. They take both those animal instincts and their fear of the dark and their concern about the passage of time and change, and how change makes them vulnerable because they can't control everything as easily if they don't know what to expect. And then they put that next to their desire to make meaning out of their lives. And those two things kind of combined is where we start to see some of the beginnings of religious understandings and rituals related to the passage of time and seasons. Any comments on any of that before we jump into talking a little bit about pre-modern humans? Didn't think you were going to have this an anthropology lesson today. Good. All right. So I learned some really interesting stuff while I was preparing for this class. I'm very, very excited to share this with you. So humans, developed over the course of millions of years from, um, through a number of different um, species in the genus Homo. And so we have to go back actually all the way to Homo erectus, which is a predecessor to Homo sapiens sapiens, which is what we are today. Homo erectus was around 2 million years ago to about 50,000 years ago. So they were around for a really long time. Um, this is the earliest sign that modern scientists have um, for the possibility of ritual in humans. The intellectual ability to control their their impulses, like their aggression against one another and things like that, allowed them to live in groups, live in community with one another to protect each other and to create kinship. And so then that started to develop the concept of moral responsibility, that the choices that I make, and I have that ability to say yes or no, I'm going to do this. I'm not just going to allow my instincts to take over and drive everything I do. And so if I'm choosing rather than just letting my instincts drive the car, so to speak, then I have to decide how it is that I'm going to make these choices. And as people, lived together and developed a sense of obligation to one another, and a burgeoning sense of what we would now call, love and family. This group identity started to develop. It's not just me, it's us. And so the all those questions that we, have been asking about the passage of time and vulnerability and meaning and how do I, continue to live, how do I survive, it's no longer just about me. My identity is wrapped up in others as well. And so, of course, that creates opportunities for, we can support one another, we can defend each other, we can protect each other when we're sleeping, things like that. But it also creates additional vulnerabilities because I can't control necessarily what the people in my group are going to do. I can say, hey, it is not safe to walk outside of the cave at night when we know that there is a predator out there. And I can decide that I'm going to stay in, but I can't control whether my child or, another member of my group decides to walk out the cave and expose themselves to that danger. And the loss of that person from my group is in some ways a loss of myself, a crisis in my own identity because I've got that group understanding of who I am. Um, so with Homo erectus, one of the really interesting things that scholars have discovered is that Homo erectus, especially as you get kind of closer to that 50,000 years ago rather than the 2 million years ago, started to develop cannibalistic tendencies. But not just, there's evidence that it wasn't just a impulse thing. Maybe at first it was, a lot of animals, just because, there's a there's a dead pile of meat on the ground. A wolf is maybe going to eat its sibling because there's, it's food, right? It's something that's going to fill my stomach and it's easy to get to. It's right there. But there is actually evidence of intentional ritualistic cannibalism in Homo erectus. There, for example, are some skulls that have been found at archaeological sites where there is a pattern to the way that the skull was broken open to access the brain. Um, and so it's thought that perhaps the reason for that was because they were cannibalizing their dead. And there's no there's no way obviously to tell this. Homo erectus didn't leave any written records for us to interpret and understand why it was that they were doing what it was that they were doing. But the thought is that the consumption of the recently deceased, the bodies of the recently deceased, in a way that seems to have some kind of ritualization to it, like that they do it the same way each time, seems to, it's they're taking care. They're not just ripping into these bodies because they're hungry. They're doing it out of maybe some kind of affection for the deceased person, some kind of part of the grieving process. As the concept of the soul started to develop, maybe the idea of taking in the body of the person is a way of taking in their soul and allowing their soul to continue to live on through their living descendants and other living members of their group. And so obviously we're reading a lot into this because we don't have any kind of uh, written record for them to say, yes, this is why we were doing this. But the records that we do have suggest that there is something ritualistic here, and it has something to do with what we've been talking about here, with the the experience of the passage of time, the passage of life, um, related to the bodies of these people. Now, obviously, there is so little of a record for something that happened 50,000 years ago, let alone 2 million years ago, because so much of what they would have used was something that would easily degrade. So we don't really have a lot of records. But with the records that we do have, with skeletons or fossilized skeletons, then we can see some of these things and put together kind of theories about what may have been going on there. And so the idea that we deal with making meaning out of our lives by allowing the some element of those whose lives have ended to continue through the consumption of the deceased into the living bodies of those who remain. You could read into that, like I said, about the soul. You could read into it about, maybe you are taking in the positive characteristics of the deceased person, their abilities, things like that, that are kind of the earliest stages of the concept of ritual. Certainly not religion at this point, but ritual. So thoughts about any of that? I know we usually talk about cannibalism as a negative thing, but from this perspective, I think it's super fascinating.
Um, did they? Well, I don't know. I mean, I can see the ritual part where they wanted to keep the person with them or that sort of thing, but it's kind of gross.
So this is just at best a theory that they can, from certain findings, archaeological findings, they're kind of putting these pieces together. It looks like it could be this. It is kind of, it's kind of interesting. That begs a lot of questions.
Yeah, it's certainly not, no, I don't think any good scholar would say this is proof that this is, how it was, but this is kind of the earliest evidence of any kind of ritualization of any sort. And I do find it fascinating that it has to do with accessing the brain of a deceased person, because those are some of the things they can tell. They can tell that at the time that the brain casing was broken, the person was already deceased. And they can tell that there was some kind of pattern to the way that they did this, because it wasn't just like this guy's head was bashed in over here and this one's was bashed in back here. It's all, there's a pattern, there's a consistency from specimen to specimen, showing that there was some kind of procedure followed for how this was done. And so those
But
things together kind of, give them this theory.
but they don't know that they ate it. They
Right.
could
They
have
could have done
done
something else. Yeah.
something else with it. Released it, buried it, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's gonna, yeah.
So maybe not as gross as you think, Karen. Who knows? All right. So let's move on to the next step, to the Neanderthals. So there, you'll notice here, the Neanderthals are actually overlapping with Homo erectus a little bit. Homo erectus kind of started to die off and fell out around 50,000 years ago. Neanderthals were around about 150,000 years ago. And it's with Neanderthals that we start to see what we would consider today to be true ritual and even early religion. And again, it has to do with death and burial. So Neanderthals are the first grouping of, what we would have falling under the general category of human, not to our species yet, but still within that genus. They're the first ones to bury their dead. The earliest of these is about 150,000 years ago. And the evidence here is not just the bones or of the deceased person, but actually markings on the bones with that seem to suggest some kind of practices related to funeral, and then also grave goods. So the placing of meaningful objects with the body. So it's not just that you're burying the body to prevent it from being eaten by a predator or something like that, but you're actually burying it with goods that ostensibly could have been used by you for by the living for their own benefit, but for some reason the person being buried, they decided that they needed this. Why? Whether they thought there was some kind of afterlife that they in which they needed it, or they were mourning and they felt that it was meaningful in some way, in the same way that today, in the tragedy of losing a small child, we might bury their favorite teddy bear with them as a comforting thing to ourselves, and to their memory, things like that. We're not really sure why they did this, but the evidence shows that there was something going on there that had to do with um, these rituals in and dealing with death, because death being kind of the biggest change, right? The biggest change that we deal with, and the unknown of what that change looks like, for the person that's on the other side of it, and the unknown of why this has to happen, things like that. I think in terms of when we're thinking about the passage of time, death is certainly up there at the top of the list as far as trying to make meaning and understanding. Um, Neanderthals also were very interestingly, they didn't change culturally very much during the time that they were around. Some of the other early humans, you can see in the archaeological evidence, you can see a lot of shifting of culture, shifting of how they lived, things like that. But the um, the way that Neanderthals lived was fairly stable over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, even while the earliest of our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, were rapidly changing in terms of their culture. And so there is something interesting in the Neanderthal archaeological record because of the stability of their culture because they didn't develop a lot of technology very quickly like Homo sapiens sapiens did. Um, you can see the the stability of that culture um, through the way that they clearly had a very solid way of teaching their culture and passing it down through the different generations. And so that even alone, is indication of some kind of level of ritual in terms of, how is it that we teach the young? We maybe don't think about it so much today as ritual, but sending your child to school to learn how to read and do math is an odd way, still kind of a ritual that we do to pass along our knowledge, to pass along our culture um, to our young, so that there is some level of stability from generation to generation. And with the Neanderthals, it was pretty stable for a long, long time. So that's kind of another instance of evidence for ritual. Comments, questions on this one? All right. So now we get to us, the species that is now us, Homo sapiens sapiens. Homo sapiens sapiens are um, are from they start to develop heavily in the upper Paleolithic era, which is about 50,000 years ago. So you notice that about the same time that Homo erectus is going away, this is when Homo sapiens sapiens is really starting to take off. And there are a couple of interesting pre-religious ritual like elements that come out of this species of early human and from this period. One of them is the Venus figure. And here is an example of a pretty good, fairly well crafted Venus figure. There are others that look kind of like lumpy potatoes or rocks that you're not entirely sure that they're right, that this is really, you know, if you're a kid in the backyard and you find a rock that looks like an arrow, or is it an arrowhead or is it just a rock that looks like a triangle? We don't really know. But this one, is pretty solidly not a rock. Somebody actually, well, it is a rock, but it's not just a rock. It's something that somebody actually carved. And so you have a variety of these from very well crafted like this one all the way to, not entirely sure this was intentional. But all of them share something, some characteristics. Even though all of these different Venus figures are separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, they all have a focus on the midsection of the statue. The face doesn't really matter. They're blank, abstract, missing completely. The hands and feet and legs and arms are small or absent entirely. What really matters is the midsection. Almost always the midsection is depicted as obese, which is interesting because there was almost no obesity among the early hunter-gatherer peoples because there just weren't enough calories around for people to become obese. But almost all of these Venus figures have this obese shape to them. They're all women. They're almost always nude, and they're usually pregnant. And so these Venus figures are understood by archaeologists to have something to do with fertility and fertility rites and fertility rituals. So interesting, we have, the development of early ritual around death. And now we have the development of a little bit, it's kind of the second step of this is the development of ritual around birth and around fertility. So I found that really fascinating that that as things are developing, we're kind of already developing this sense of the passage of time and change and the seasons of life at least. Another concept category that was developing during this time with Homo sapiens sapiens is the early um, the early development of what archaeologists call shamanism. Now, shamanism in this sense is not the same thing as what you would understand to be, kind of a more modern, modern folk religion, um, medicine man, type of thing. This is referring kind of broadly to the sense of just spiritual experiences that maybe were um, placed into the responsibility of a particular person within a community. Sometimes there is evidence that people were placed into some kind of altered state of consciousness through, the use of different plants that, we would now call drugging them into altered states of consciousness. But as we talked about with our experiences in the dark, our brains are already um, set up to create, to be creative with filling in the blanks when we don't understand something or we don't have enough data to be working with. If we're sitting in the dark, we're going to start seeing things, or we're going to start, our minds are going to start wandering and coming up with new ideas. And so it's not, I don't think it's surprising that the concept of, spirits, deities, the ability to be in relationship with those spirits, especially through the use of plants in altered states, gives you, access to a spiritual realm that you wouldn't necessarily have access to under normal circumstances. Here's something that's interesting. During this period, it doesn't seem like burial rituals were for everyone. When a burial is found on an archaeological site, there seems to be a pattern to it. Typically, the people that are found are men. They are almost always younger men or men with physical disabilities. And many times they are buried in tombs or other, burial sites where they are placed with other people. They're often posed in a strange position that we wouldn't normally, consider to be appropriate for burial. And there are lots of meaningful, valuable grave goods found with them. And so some scholars think that um, the evidence points to these burials actually being specialized for the people in the community who represented the divine or represented the spirits to the people. So we don't have the burial sites, we don't have the bones, we don't have the remains of your average person because they didn't bury those people. They, let them out to be scavenged, or they, threw them in the river. We don't know what they did with them, but they didn't put them in a place where their remains would be able to be found tens of thousands of years later. But these people in particular, these young men who often had physical disabilities, are the ones that are found. Why is that? Well, the theory is that these were the shamans. These were the people who had some kind of religious significance in their communities. And so they were singled out um, for whatever it was that their communities, decided it was a physical difference, or maybe sometimes they had psychological differences. They were neurodivergent in some kind of way, but they were actually the ones who were pointed out as special and therefore, um, able to connect more easily to the spirit, the spiritual realm. I thought that was really interesting. And then as we kind of continue to develop this idea about the passage of time and the seasons of life, during this period, um, there seems to be kind of a life cycle based development of rites of passage in the cultures. There's evidence of dedicated places that were intended to be where babies were born. So people would send their pregnant women to these birthing huts or birthing, buildings or birthing caves, and that is where they would be secluded from society because birth was a spiritually dangerous, a physically dangerous experience. There's no modern medicine to save you if you have any kind of problem in your birth experience. And so there's a lot of death related to that. And so in those moments of transition, there's birth, there's death, all happening at once. And there is spiritual danger in that. And so the idea of that kind of as a separate thing develops. And we can see that in the archaeological record, as well as some of the more, I think, familiar to us types of rites of passage rituals, like the exclusion, the seclusion of, for example, young men who are preparing for, coming of age rituals from the rest of the people for a time, things like that. So we're starting to see, some things that are a little bit more familiar to us in the modern world. Questions about any of that or comments? No. All right. So now we're finally kind of getting up toward today, sort of. So we start to see, now we're into the Neolithic period. The Neolithic period was approximately 10,000 years ago. So right before we start to see, some of the early biblical mythologies, things like that, that start to become more part of kind of what we understand to be history rather than prehistory. The concept of a yearly calendar starts to develop during this time. We see as people are no longer just hunter-gatherers, but they start to develop agriculture, they start to understand that if they plant certain types of plants in a certain place, they can, they will produce more than if they plant them in other places. They start to understand that if they find the stalk of wheat or early wheat that is bigger than others and they use that one to make more, then they can, develop husbandry and the control of their environment, and they actually become agricultural, and so then they can settle. They don't have to travel and follow the herds to hunt their food anymore, and then their lives become more than just about aging and dying and birthing and aging and dying. It becomes about that harvest. It becomes about the agricultural season, and so then it becomes less about the life cycle and more about the cycle of the year. And so then you start to see evidence of a variety of rituals related to different deities, grain-based deities, praying and sacrificing for good harvest at the beginning of the planting season, celebrations during the harvest season of the plentiful, bountiful harvest, things like that. And then during this period, you also see the development of a variety of tiers within the society, because people are more stable and placed in one place. They're able to kind of start to target their their interest and their skills, and so then you start getting aristocracy. You start getting people who are monarchs, kings or leaders of some kind. You also start to get spiritual leaders. You start to get people who are um, responsible for, the religious life of the community. And then you start to develop the concept of different gods that are connected to different parts of life. So then you start to kind of see a lot more stratification, not just among the people, but also among, their gods, and dividing things out into harvest versus planting, and things like that. We start to actually see art during this period and architecture. We have Stonehenge, which is a famous example of the megalith, the stone circles, and the worship of, or worship with, the sun. We see some examples and some evidence for ancestor worship. Skeletons that are placed in particular places for the purpose of religious rituals and things like that. Um, Following the cycles of the sun and the moon, which make a lot of sense because the sun has a lot to do with, the harvest and the ability to grow um, produce and agriculture, things like that. And certainly the following the interest in the developing interest in the cycles of celestial bodies with, the sun. We notice that when it's hotter outside, the sun comes higher in the sky and it's out longer. When it's colder outside, the sun isn't up as long in the day. And so we know that the sun is the source of our not just our light, but also our heat and our warmth. And that seems to be what makes the plants grow. And so we worship that thing. We want it to like us and come out as often as possible. That kind of makes sense, to a brain that is obviously still developing. And I mean, it makes sense to me even, and I hope, my brain is done developing, at least for me, for my lifetime, unfortunately. So we kind of start getting to some of the things that we're a little bit more familiar with in terms of early religion and early ritual. And from here you can see how easily we can start to go to things that are even more familiar, like Greek gods and Roman gods and Norse gods and things like that. So what are our thoughts about all of that kind of cycle, that sweeping overview of that?
Well, from a scientific basis, I mean, how they actually can go back and they can look and they've found all of this stuff. How does that play in with the religious piece of it, the creation of how does that marry in? How does religion marry in with that? When does you're talking about millions of years ago, before Homo sapiens and the erectus and the what have you. So how does so where does that all play in? I guess is through all of this, which we can document. Then where does, and you can see how that developed and how they, not knowing anything, they they saw the sun and the warmth and they connected those, or they saw birth and death and they connected those. But how does that fit in with actual religion as we know it today, or as we've been taught for,
So I think if we kind of take our personal beliefs as Christians and put that to the side for a moment, and look at the concept of religion from a sociological perspective, I think all of this actually makes a lot of sense. The idea of the development of the human brain, then requiring the not requiring, but leading to the development of the human impulse for meaning, the constant asking of why. Why is it this way? Why does time pass? Why do I have to die? Those questions, as as brains got bigger and more complicated and people became able to ask more complicated questions, then they started to come up with more and more complicated answers to those questions. And so that's why I find it fascinating that, we start with kind of the most basic thing, why do we have to die? We're still asking that question today, right? And then we connect that to birth. We observe the world around us and we ask why. And when the answers that we are looking for can't be found in the natural world, then we look to the supernatural world. We start to understand that there is maybe something outside of what we can, what our senses can touch and feel and see. And so then we look to that to see if that might help to satisfy our deep desire for meaning and understanding of what it is that's happening around us. And so over the course of time, then we start to kind of share our ideas with each other and develop understanding and shared beliefs with one another. And it's easy to see how you can rely so heavily on the sun to make sure that you can eat this year. But if you don't understand, scientifically that the sun is actually a ball of burning gas that is billions and billions of miles away from us, then you're going to come up with a different answer for what that is and why it's here and how to keep it coming back and make sure that it's not going to leave you permanently, because every day her part of the year, it goes away for the day earlier and earlier, and that kind of freaks you out. And so you want to do something. What can I do to make sure that this doesn't keep happening and eventually it's gone, because I need this thing to survive? And so then we start to do rituals, and we start to teach, our children, oh, well, we do this to make sure that the sun comes back. And then that becomes, we must do this thing to make sure the sun comes back. And that becomes, the next step. And, oh, well, why? The sun is just a ball of, it's just a light in the sky. Oh, well, there's a God related to this thing. And so we have to worship the God to make sure that the God brings us the sun, or, and then we end up with, things like Apollo and Ra and all of these things. So I think it's a very slow progression of understanding from a sociological perspective. Now, when we add in the perspective of faith, in our own faith, I can't speak to how other faiths would understand this, but it only becomes a challenge, I think, to a Christian faith that requires that what is in our Bible be historically accurate. When we are asking questions about where did we come from and why are we the way we are, and we read our scriptures as a historical record of what happened, then I think we are actually missing out on a major point of scriptures, which is to help us answer those why questions.
So is there a general feeling of when scripture began? Was it 50,000 years ago? Was it I'm not putting this very clearly because it's pretty difficult to state, when you're trying to marry these two together, which is what we tangibly know and can prove to what our faith is.
So for me, I think what matters isn't so much, when was the world created? I think that the stories that we have in our scripture are myths in the good sense of that word. I think you've come to some of my classes at the church before where we talked about this word myth and how people tend to use it in a negative way, that, well, oh, that's just a myth, that's not fact. But when I use the word myth, I mean a story that helps us understand who we are, helps us answer those big why questions about our human experience. And so when we read a story like God created the world in 7 days, and we are reading that as historical fact, then yes, that does conflict with what I just talked about with the slow development of human understanding and, evolution and things like that. But if we read our scripture, if we read that same story from the perspective of how is this story helping me to understand how the world works and why I'm here, then we can actually find some really interesting stuff. For example, just from that story that we're using as an example right now, Genesis chapter 1, the sun is not created until I think like the fourth or fifth day. Light is created on the first day, but the sun itself, the celestial bodies don't come in until several days later. And
Right.
that is a statement. That is a theological statement over against peoples that worship the sun. They are the people who, the person who wrote that poem is not just saying, "Oh, this is the order that things were made in." That person is saying, God created the world. God is in charge of this world, not the sun. You worship the sun, but I worship the one who created the sun and created the light that the sun now represents for you. And so you've got it backwards, buddy, because you're worshiping the created object while I'm worshiping the
The
creator.
creator.
And so if you read the Bible just as facts, just as a list of historical things that happened, you completely miss out on the richness of reading the Bible as a story. And so to me, I'm not threatened by the things that I've talked about today in terms of the development of ritual and the development of religion over the course of millions of years, because I believe that God has had a hand in all of that the whole time, and that God has been guiding the development of human beings through evolution, making sure that we are connected to other parts of our creation. When people say, "Oh, they're those evolutionists, they just think that we're nothing but monkeys." To me, the response to that is, isn't it amazing that God gives us the gift of not just being responsible for the things that are on our earth, like our Genesis chapter 2 tells us that God created all these things and gave them to Adam to take care of. God actually made us related to them. And so we have to understand that we don't just have the obligation to take care of them because God gave it to us. We have that obligation because they're part of us. They are our family member. And so I think that gives us even more of a richness in our scientific understanding. That gives us more richness to understand from a theological perspective if we're not so defensive about everything being factual and making sure that it's completely accurate and lines up perfectly with what our Bible tells us. Now, of course, this is all from a particular religious perspective. When we're talking about this whole class, the sacred seasons, and talking about ritual and religion from a variety of different perspectives, other religions are going to take that from a different angle and a different understanding. Jews, they share um, some of the same scriptures as us, but they read some of them very differently than we do. Because they come from a different place, and the big questions that they're asking of the world and of themselves are going to be a little bit different than the big questions that Christians are asking, because their cultural background and the stories and the perspectives that they inherited from their predecessors are different than ours. They're closer, obviously, than others because we have that shared history, but they're still not the same. So even when there are religions that have that kind of tight knit um, foundation, they're going to look different. Imagine what it's going to look like when we have to look at other traditions that did not come out of the same place and time and assumptions. So that's what's going to be really interesting to me, is as we go through this, can we talk about some of those things and how a different perspective actually can open up a whole new avenue for us to explore, how might this, if we were to just, kind of just for a minute throw out our interpretation of this particular part of, our religion, and think about how might this perspective um, fit in? How might this help us to enrich and color our perspectives? And that's kind of, I'm hoping, what we can do with this class in general is to allow those other perspectives not to threaten us, but to enrich what it is that we already have going on and challenge us to think about things in a different way.
Well, I don't remember what year it is on the Jewish calendar today, but um, they go back way further than we do, and so do some other religions. They go way back, and we kind of feel like everything was just invented when we said it was, you know. And I'm not so sure. I agree with you that God has been in control of this whole thing from the very beginning because it says so in the Bible, that God created everything. So why didn't he create those people or what, the ancestors or whatever? I don't have a problem with it. I guess is what I'm saying. Because I feel like God's hand has been involved from the very beginning.
Yeah, I think so what you're referring to is the Jewish calendar goes back to what they deem to be creation. Some some other calendars go to other dated creation times or other events.
Right.
In Islam, the calendar goes from a certain point in the development of the formation of Islam, things like that. um, but for me, like, why do we have to limit ourselves to our own, our human calculations of how much time we think it takes to do X, Y, or Z? um, a poem in which it says that it took God 7 days to create everything, but then there was no sun and there was no moon until the fifth day. Well, for us, how do we know that a day has passed? It's because the sun comes up and goes down and then comes back up, right? That's 24 hours. That's a day. But if there's no sun yet, then we have no concept of what a day is to God. So maybe it took 13 billion years, and from our perspective and our understanding of time, for God to get from nothing to where we are today. And I have no problem with that. That doesn't affect me. That doesn't hurt me. That doesn't threaten me in any way. But it takes a little bit of religious imagination to kind of get our brains out of that place where we are so tightly bound by um, by that factualism. I don't want to worship facts. I want to worship God. And I find the Bible to be rich and interesting and fascinating and infuriating because it isn't just a book of facts. It's a book of stories. It's the story of God. It's the story of God's relationship with us. And just like humans are complicated, so is the Bible. And so I don't want it to be easy, because if it was easy, it wouldn't mean anything. It wouldn't really speak to us and the complications of our lives.
Do you remember the class we had where we talked about the fact that um, God kept doing it over because he wanted people to get to a certain point and they wouldn't, and so then he would cause something to happen like a flood or whatever and start all over again. And we don't know how many times God did that. you know uh, I mean, maybe he thought those early people were going to be what he wanted, but then it turned out that they couldn't. You know, um, I don't know. It just seemed to me like we had that whole conversation about how we try things and they don't work, and so then we have to go back to the beginning and try something else.
Yeah, I think it takes a lot of humility, but then, that takes us right back, I think, to the beginning of our conversation because we're talking about control and being able to, you know, anticipate what's coming so that we can survive, so that we can thrive, so that we can have power, so that, whatever it is that's going to make you feel like you've made it in your particular level of human development, we have to know what's coming next, right? And so if we read the Bible as facts, then we can know what's coming next. But if we open ourselves to the possibility that we don't really know and we shouldn't know, and it's up to God to know, then that takes a lot of faith and that takes a lot of humility to be able to kind of put that aside and say, I don't know, but let's explore what this possibility might look like today. It might not lead anywhere, but it might lead somewhere really interesting where we can learn something about ourselves and learn something about God and learn something about what a new possibility is for, for who we are.
Okay.
All right. Oh, go ahead,
During
Cindy.
my confirmation, our pastor said to us as confirmands, if you get hung up on Genesis 1, you're going to miss out on a whole lot of good stuff.
That's true. That's true.
Well,
So
it's that
I
whole free will thing too.
yes, we do have that whole free will thing, but that's not this series, Karen. So we'll have to hold on to that until next year. Maybe we can talk about that one when we get to the enlightenment and knowledge section. So just to kind of to summarize, what we've talked about today, we have the concept of time. I think develops along with the size of brains and the complexity of brains and the human experience. And I'm using the word human loosely. Some of these archaeologists would be angry with me because human is only a word that we use for a particular species of mammal, but I'm using it loosely. Homo erectus can be human to me. I don't care. But the idea around, first we have life cycles. What is changing? Well, I am alive today. Yesterday I was not alive. Today I am aware that I am alive, and yesterday I wasn't because I was too young and my brain wasn't developed enough. But now I'm aware that I am also going to die, and so what do I do with the time that I have from now until that day? And what does it mean when people that I rely on, who rely on me, who have done things for me, who I feel moral responsibility to, what does it mean when they die? And how does that affect me? And how does that affect them? Um, and so then we develop, the sense of the concept of rites of passage, the changes in our lives that we recognize and celebrate and do something related to. And so we start to ritualize that. Then we start to develop the rituals, not just about death and birth and that kind of thing, but sustaining life, as we develop the ability to harvest and plant and live in one place because we have the ability to make our own food rather than having to chase our food. Then the harvest becomes important, planting becomes important, animal husbandry becomes important, taking care of those animals and understanding that we shouldn't take them for granted, even though they happen to all be here right now. Maybe tomorrow they won't be, and so we have to acknowledge, their existence and where they came from and where did they come from. Maybe they came from some kind of god of goats or whatever it is. The passing of a life force from one being to another. When we kill an animal and we eat its flesh, that allows us to continue to live. And so there is something spiritual about that exchange of one life for another, the sustaining of one life in exchange for another life. for rituals related to health and healing, and how do we make sure that we stay at a place where we can be contributing to our society and not falling ill and risking death, things like that. But ultimately about making meaning out of the world around us. We can't control the change of seasons. We can't control the fact that we age and die. We can't control so many things in our world. But what we can do is make meaning out of them, understand them more, and find the rhythms, find the patterns that help us to feel more secure as we live in them. And so I think ultimately the development of ritual and religion is about that. It's about looking at the world, looking at the chaos that is around us and finding meaning in it, finding patterns in it. And the fact that those patterns exist to me is a sign that God exists, because otherwise why would there be, why would there be patterns to the world without something, someone sentient making it happen. So that's kind of where those are some concepts that I think we want to bring with us as we go into this year of study. And so because of that, we're going to talk about all of these things from the perspective of several different categories. First, we have the types of categories related to the natural passage of time. So we've got light and darkness in terms of day and night. We've got the production of food like harvests and winter solstices and spring and planting, rogation, and the summer solstice when things are at their height, things like that. So the changing of seasons, the changing of time as it relates to nature. But then we also have the time, the changing of humans as they grow in a variety of ways. And so we're going to also talk about we'll have some topics related to categories of human experience, human flourishing. So we'll have one on knowledge, rituals, and seasons and holidays. We'll have one on the celebration of new years, new beginnings. We'll have one on repentance, the relationship of humans to the deity, or humans to the kind of spiritual, something that is bigger than themselves. And then also community building. We'll do a session on relationships and community with one another. And all of these things fit into this passage of time concept, but they all relate to time in slightly different ways, or change in slightly different ways, I suppose. So that's the plan for this year. Each month we'll have a different one of these topics. Sometimes it will be something related to something that's happening in that time. So for example, next month for October, we'll talk about harvest festivals. Other times we'll have a New Year one in January. We'll have one on repentance rituals and holidays. At one point, we'll do a spring one as we get closer to the spring, and then the very last one we'll do in May, because that's the closest we get to summer, and we'll do a summer solstice one, because there's a lot related to the height of summer and all of that. So I'm so excited about this. I think it's really clever, a really clever way to do this. Rather than dividing it out by the religion, we'll divide it out by the category and see what we can come up with. I haven't put together any of these other lessons yet, so we'll see what happens. I really enjoy the process of putting the lessons together, because you never know what God's gonna put in front of me. This past time I read a lot about cannibalism. Bob and David both came into my office and said, "What are you looking at?" Like, don't worry about it. I'm learning about human cannibalism. So, any comments or questions or thoughts about what you'd like to see come up this year that I haven't already said?
I just have to see it. Yeah, I'm really interested in learning about how the different ways that these things are celebrated or remembered, you know, um, and how they relate to where we are. I'm really interested in that.
Me too.
I'm really excited for the study, and you haven't let me down, Katie, because your approach is going to be really interesting. I'm looking forward.
Enlightening. The word's
Yeah,
enlightening.
enlightening.
And yeah, enlightening is up there. Well, we're really excited to have you, Diane. We'll have our other couple of newbies to our group next time as well, so you won't have to feel like you haven't been around for all of Cindy's inside jokes.
Well, thank you. It's going to be a really different perspective in seeing how each of these seasons, how different, how important or unimportant they are to different religions.
Yeah, I think that'll be fascinating, and actually also seeing how much we have in common too. That they might call it something different and they might celebrate it a little differently, but so many of these categories are things that we all do. We just maybe don't think about it as connected. So that'll be, and I'm going to be super excited, and it'll be fascinating to see what connections I can run into.
Okay.
All right, well, thanks everybody.
Okay.
We'll post this online tomorrow, and then we will get together again next month to really get started.
Okay,
Okay.
great.